They laughed at her. Three wealthy men in expensive suits refused to pay a bill because they believed a waitress had no power. What they didn't know was that the owner of the restaurant was about to walk in, and when he did, everything changed. The lunch rush at Magnolia Bistro was always unforgiving. The polished marble floors reflected golden sunlight pouring in through tall glass windows, while the gentle clink of silverware mixed with low conversations and soft jazz humming through the speakers. To customers, it was elegance, calm, luxury. To Emily Carter, it was survival. By the time the clock edged past 2 in the afternoon, Emily had already been on her feet for nearly 6 hours straight. Her calves burned. Her shoulders ached from carrying trays heavier than they looked. The faint smile she wore for customers was no longer effortless. It was practiced. She wiped her palms discreetly against her apron before lifting another tray. Table 12, she whispered to herself. She already knew who was sitting there. 3 men, sharp suits, gold watches, voices just loud enough to remind everyone else in the room that they mattered. They had arrived earlier than most, ordering the most expensive items on the menu without even glancing at prices. Premium steak, imported wine, extras they barely touched. From the moment Emily had approached their table, something felt wrong. Not rude at first, not openly hostile, just dismissive. They barely acknowledged her questions. One waved his hand instead of speaking. Another interrupted her mid-sentence. When she placed the plates down carefully, one of them smirked, eyes scanning her uniform like it defined her entire worth. Emily pushed the thought away. She had learned to do that. Growing up, she'd learned that dignity didn't always come from how others treated you, but how you carried yourself despite it. She balanced the tray in her hands and approached. "Excuse me, gentlemen," she said politely. "Here's your bill. Take your time." She placed the leather folder gently on the table and turned to leave. That was when she heard the laugh, a sharp, mocking sound. "Hey, wait." Emily froze. She turned back slowly. One of the men leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms casually. Sunlight bounced off the face of his watch as he tilted his wrist, as if checking time or showing it off. "Are you actually serious with this?" he asked, tapping the bill with one finger. Emily blinked. "I'm sorry, sir?" The man lifted the folder and flipped it open dramatically. "This number," he said, grinning at his companions. "You expect us to pay this?" His friends chuckled. Emily's stomach tightened. "Yes, sir," she said evenly. "That's the total for your order." Another man leaned forward now, elbows on the table, eyes narrowing just slightly. "We didn't enjoy the service." Emily felt her throat dry. "I'm sorry to hear that," she replied carefully. "If there's something I can fix—" "No," the third man interrupted. "What we've decided is that we're not paying." The words landed like a slap. Emily's fingers tightened around the edge of the tray. I don't understand," she said. The first man shrugged. "Seems pretty simple to us." They laughed again. Emily's heart began to race. She had worked at Magnolia Bistro for nearly 2 years. She knew the policies, she knew the rules, and she knew what refusing payment meant. For her, "Sir," she said softly but firmly, "I can call my manager if there's an issue." The tallest man leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You're just a waitress," he said. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The restaurant noise seemed to fade. Emily felt suddenly very small. She glanced around instinctively, hoping someone, anyone, had noticed. But the room remained wrapped in its own world. Conversations continued. Glasses clinked. Life moved on. She swallowed. "I can't let you leave without paying," she said, her voice trembling now despite her effort. The men exchanged amused looks. "Oh," one said, smiling coldly. "Watch us." Emily stood there, frozen between fear and responsibility, unaware that within minutes, everything was about to change. Emily remained standing by the table longer than she should have. In hospitality, hesitation was dangerous. It could turn a minor issue into a scene, and scenes, especially with wealthy guests, had consequences that usually didn't fall on the people wearing tailored suits. They fell on people like her. She inhaled slowly, the way she had taught herself to do whenever panic crept in. In through the nose, out through the mouth, just long enough to keep her voice steady. "Gentlemen," she said again, carefully choosing each word, "if there's a concern with the food or service, my manager would be happy to—" The man with the gold watch cut her off with a sharp laugh. "Listen to her," he said to his friends. "She thinks she has options." They leaned back in their chairs like spectators enjoying a performance. Emily felt heat rush to her face. Not from embarrassment, but from exhaustion. She had started this shift before the sun fully rose, slipping out of her small apartment quietly so she wouldn't wake her younger brother, Noah. She'd left behind a sticky note on the fridge, reminding him to eat breakfast. and not be late for school again, because Noah didn't have anyone else reminding him. Their parents were gone. A car accident years ago had taken more than just 2 lives. It had taken stability, security, and the luxury of choice. Emily had been barely 19 when everything changed. College hadn't stopped, bills hadn't paused, rent hadn't waited, so she worked. First mornings at a cafe, then evenings at Magnolia Bistro, sometimes both. Tips weren't extra money. They were groceries, bus fare, school supplies. They were the difference between keeping the lights on and sitting in the dark. And now, 3 men who could drop her rent money on a single bottle of wine were laughing at the idea of paying for what they consumed. "I'm not trying to cause trouble," Emily said quietly, "but refusing to pay isn't an option." The tallest man raised an eyebrow. "Is that a threat?" "No," she replied quickly. "It's policy." The word seemed to amuse them. "Policy?" one repeated mockingly. "That's adorable." Emily felt her hands shake, so she clasped them together in front of her apron, digging her nails into her palms to stay grounded. "Please," she said, "I could lose my job." That was the truth, and the truth, apparently, was entertaining. One of the men leaned closer, his voice dropping low enough to feel personal. "Maybe you should have picked a better job." Something inside Emily cracked, not enough to shatter, but enough to ache. She straightened her shoulders. "I work hard," she said, "and I deserve respect." The table went silent. For a brief moment, Emily thought maybe, just maybe, her words had reached them. Then the first man smiled. "Respect," he said slowly, "is earned." Emily realized then that nothing she said would change their minds. They weren't confused. They weren't dissatisfied. They were testing how far they could go. She turned slightly, eyes scanning the dining room again. Her manager was nowhere in sight. The hostess stand was busy. Other servers rushed past with trays, unaware of the quiet storm forming at table 12. Her heart pounded. "If you won't pay," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper now, "I'll have to call the owner." That did it. Laughter burst out loud enough for nearby tables to glance over. "The owner?" the gold watchman scoffed. "You mean Jonathan Sullivan?" Emily nodded. "Yes, sir." They laughed harder. "You think a billionaire is going to come running because a waitress can't handle a bill?" one of them said. "He's probably on a yacht right now." The humiliation burned. But Emily didn't back down. "Mr. Sullivan believes in fairness," she said, surprising even herself. "That's why people respect this place." The men exchanged looks, something flickering between annoyance and disbelief. Before they could respond, the front door of Magnolia Bistro opened. A sudden hush rippled through the room. Emily felt it before she saw it. Oh, the air shifted, the kind of silence that didn't demand attention, but commanded it. She turned slowly and saw him. Jonathan Sullivan didn't announce himself. He never did. That was part of what made him so formidable. No entourage, no raised voice, no dramatic entrance. Just a tall man in a dark jacket, sleeves rolled slightly at the wrist, stepping into Magnolia Bistro as if it were any other place in the world. Yet the room reacted instantly. Conversations softened. Chairs stopped scraping. Even the background music seemed to fade beneath the weight of his presence. Emily had seen him only once before, months ago, from a distance. Back then, he'd looked like a man who belonged everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Calm, observant, unbothered by attention. Now, standing just inside the doorway, he looked exactly the same, and yet different. His eyes scanned the room slowly, not searching for admiration, but for imbalance, for something out of place. They landed on table 12, on the 3 men sitting too comfortably, on the unpaid check folded neatly beneath a water glass, and finally, on Emily. She felt it like a spotlight, though his gaze wasn't harsh. It was assessing, measured, as if he were reading a story written between clenched fists and trembling resolve. Jonathan walked forward with unhurried steps, each one echoing faintly against the polished floor. The 3 men noticed him at the same time. The laughter died mid-breath. The gold watchman stiffened. His confident posture sagged just slightly, enough to betray recognition. That's him," one whispered. Jonathan stopped beside the table, resting one hand lightly on the back of an empty chair. "What seems to be the problem?" he asked. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The tallest man cleared his throat, scrambling for composure. "Sir, there's no real issue, just a misunderstanding." Jonathan didn't look at him. He looked at Emily. She hesitated for half a second, then stepped forward. "They're refusing to pay," she said. Her voice wavered at first, then steadied. "They said my service wasn't worth anything." Silence followed, the kind that presses on your ears. Jonathan's jaw tightened, not in rage, but in restraint. He turned his attention to the men now. "Is that true?" he asked. The gold watchman forced a chuckle. "Come on, Mr. Sullivan. It's just a joke." Jonathan tilted his head slightly. "Jokes," he said, are usually funny to everyone involved. No one laughed. The man shifted in his seat. We weren't satisfied. Jonathan glanced at the untouched plates. Interesting, he said, because your meals are finished. One of the men opened his mouth to argue, but Jonathan raised a hand, calmly, decisively. This restaurant doesn't run on entitlement, he continued. It runs on effort, on people who show up, stand on their feet for hours, and treat strangers with respect whether it's returned or not. Emily felt something tighten in her chest. He was defending her, publicly, without hesitation. Jonathan's voice lowered, not softer, but sharper. You will pay your bill, in full, and you will apologize. The tallest man swallowed. This is unnecessary, he muttered. Jonathan met his eyes. What's unnecessary, he replied, is thinking your wealth excuses your behavior. The men exchanged panicked glances. Slowly, reluctantly, they reached into their wallets. Cash hit the table in uneven stacks, heavier than required. Jonathan didn't look at the money. Apologize, he repeated. One by one, the men mumbled their apologies, words hollow, rushed, embarrassed. Emily stood frozen, hardly daring to breathe. Jonathan turned to her. You did the right thing, he said quietly. The weight of the moment crashed over her. Tears burned behind her eyes, not of weakness, but relief. The men stood quickly, chairs scraping loudly as they fled toward the exit, heads down, dignity left behind. As the door closed behind them, the restaurant erupted into soft applause. Emily felt her knees weaken. Jonathan placed a steady hand on her shoulder. I don't tolerate disrespect, he said, especially toward people who keep this place alive. She nodded, unable to speak. For the first time that day, maybe for the first time in a long while, Emily felt seen. The applause didn't last long. It never did. People clapped, smiled, returned to their meals. And just like that, life inside Magnolia Bistro resumed its rhythm. Forks clinked against plates. Glasses filled again. Conversations picked up where they'd left off. But for Emily, everything felt different. Her hands still trembled as she cleared the table where the men had been sitting. The cash lay neatly stacked now, heavier than it had any right to feel. It wasn't just money. It was proof. Proof that she hadn't imagined the humiliation. Proof that she hadn't been wrong to stand her ground. Jonathan remained nearby, speaking quietly with the manager, his posture relaxed but attentive. Every so often, his eyes flicked toward Emily, not in scrutiny, but concern. That alone unsettled her. People like him didn't usually notice people like her. Emily carried the dishes to the kitchen, her chest tight as adrenaline slowly drained away. Only then did she realize how exhausted she truly was. Her legs ached, her shoulders sagged. 6 hours into her shift, and she still had 4 to go. She leaned briefly against the stainless steel counter, closing her eyes. You're okay, she told herself. It's over. But memories crept in anyway. Her mother's voice reminding her to stand up straight. Her father's hands steady on the steering wheel. The sound of metal twisting. The silence afterward. She swallowed hard and forced herself upright. Emily, she turned. Jonathan stood just inside the kitchen doorway. The room seemed to shrink around him. I hope I'm not interrupting, he said. No, sir, she replied quickly, wiping her hands on her apron. I mean, Mr. Sullivan, he smiled faintly. Jonathan is fine. That simple sentence, spoken without superiority, nearly undid her. I wanted to check on you, he continued. That situation shouldn't have happened. Emily hesitated, then nodded. Thank you for stepping in. You stepped in first, he said. That matters. She looked down. I was scared. Courage usually is, Jonathan replied. They stood in silence for a moment, the hum of the kitchen filling the space between them. How long have you worked here? He asked. Almost 2 years. And before that? She exhaled. Everywhere, she said softly. Anywhere that was hiring. Jonathan studied her, not like a boss evaluating performance, but like a man piecing together a story. You don't speak like someone who plans to stay a waitress forever. Emily gave a small, tired smile. I don't plan much, she admitted. I just survive. Jonathan nodded slowly. That's more planning than most people ever do. He glanced toward the dining room. I won't keep you, he said, but I'd like to talk again, after your shift. Her heart skipped. Did I do something wrong? No, he said gently. You did something right. Jonathan stepped away, leaving her with more questions than answers. As Emily returned to work, she felt the weight of the day pressing down on her. But beneath it, something else stirred. Hope, not the reckless kind that promises too much, or the quiet kind, the kind that whispers, maybe this moment mattered. The dinner rush crept in quietly. By the time Emily realized how busy Magnolia Bistro had become, every table was filled. The low golden lights reflected off polished wood and glassware, casting a warm glow that masked the tension still lingering beneath the surface. To everyone else, the earlier incident was already fading into a story they'd retell later. To Emily, it was still alive inside her chest. She moved from table to table on instinct, taking orders, refilling glasses, smiling when expected. But her thoughts drifted elsewhere. Every so often, she caught sight of Jonathan Sullivan seated near the window, speaking with a guest, laughing softly. He looked like he belonged to another world entirely, and yet he'd seen her. That fact alone made her hands shake. During a brief lull, Emily slipped into the storage hallway behind the kitchen. She pressed her back against the wall, breathing slowly. The smell of cleaning solution stung her nose, grounding her. She thought of her brother, Lucas, 16 years old, smart, angry, too proud to admit how scared he was of becoming invisible. Everything she did, every double shift, every insult swallowed, was for him. Their parents had died 3 years earlier. A drunk driver, a red light, a moment that split their lives in two. Emily had been 19. College dreams vanished overnight. Tuition money turned into rent. Textbooks replaced with grocery lists. Youth traded for responsibility without ceremony. She became a guardian before she fully understood how to be an adult. People saw a waitress. They never saw the weight behind her eyes. "Emily?" She startled. Her manager, Claire, stood at the end of the hallway. "You okay?" Claire asked quietly. Emily nodded too quickly. "Yes, just tired." Claire studied her for a moment, then softened. "You handled yourself well today," she said. "Not everyone would have." Emily swallowed. "I didn't want to cause trouble." "You didn't," Claire replied. "You stopped it." Before Emily could respond, Claire hesitated. "Jonathan asked if you'd be willing to sit down with him after your shift." Emily's breath caught. "Why?" Claire shrugged. "He didn't say, but if I had to guess, people like him don't forget moments like today." Emily nodded, unsure whether to feel nervous or grateful. The rest of the shift passed in fragments. Faces blurred, orders repeated, feet ached. Finally, mercifully, the clock crept toward closing. When Emily untied her apron, her shoulders sagged with exhaustion. She splashed water on her face in the bathroom mirror, staring at the woman looking back. Dark circles under her eyes, hair pulled into a practical bun, a strength she hadn't asked for, but carried anyway. "You're just a waitress," a voice whispered. Then another answered. "You're more than that." She stepped back into the dining room. Jonathan stood, waiting. The restaurant was quieter now, chairs stacked, lights dimmed slightly. The world felt suspended, as if something important was about to be said. "Long day," Jonathan said. She smiled faintly. "Most days are." They sat at a corner table. No servers, no audience, just two people. "I didn't step in today because I'm the owner," Jonathan began. "I stepped in because I recognized something." Emily tilted her head slightly. "What?" "Integrity," he said. "The kind that doesn't announce itself." She looked down at her hands. "I didn't think," she admitted. "I just couldn't let them walk all over me." Jonathan nodded. "Do you know how rare that is?" She shrugged. "People like me don't have many choices." Jonathan leaned forward slightly. "That's where you're wrong," he said softly. "You have more choices than you realize. You've just been too busy carrying everyone else to notice." Emily's throat tightened. No one had ever said that to her. They talked longer than she expected. About Lucas, about responsibility, about dreams postponed, not abandoned. Jonathan listened more than he spoke, and when he finally stood, his voice was thoughtful. "I'd like you to come by my office tomorrow," he said. "Just a conversation." Emily's pulse quickened. "I don't even know why you'd want that." Jonathan smiled. Not like a billionaire, but like a man who'd once been overlooked himself. "Because courage like yours doesn't belong behind a tray forever." Emily watched him leave, her mind racing. Outside, the night air was cool. Streetlights flickered on, bathing the sidewalk in amber glow. For the first time in years, Emily walked home without feeling invisible. Something had shifted, not because someone rescued her, but because someone finally saw her. Emily barely slept that night. The ceiling fan above her bed turned slowly, clicking with every rotation. Shadows stretched and shrank across the cracked plaster ceiling of the small apartment she shared with Lucas. The room smelled faintly of detergent and old books. Tomorrow kept replaying in her mind. Jonathan Sullivan's office. The words felt unreal. She turned onto her side and glanced at the alarm clock glowing red. 2:17 a.m. Her thoughts drifted back years. Back to a time before responsibility wrapped around her life like a tightening rope. She had wanted to be a teacher once, not for the salary, not for the prestige, but because someone had once believed in her, her mother. "You don't just notice people, Emily," she'd said. "You understand them." That voice echoed now, bittersweet. In the next room, Lucas slept on the couch, one arm dangling over the edge, headphones still around his neck. Emily watched him for a moment, then quietly covered him with a blanket. She whispered a promise he'd never hear. I'm trying. Morning came fast. Emily dressed carefully. Not her uniform, but not anything fancy either. She chose the cleanest blouse she owned and a pair of worn flats. Her hands trembled as she tied her hair back. Jonathan Sullivan's office was in the same building as Magnolia Bistro, but it might as well have been another universe. Glass doors, quiet hallways, walls lined with abstract art. She checked in at the front desk, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm here to see Mr. Sullivan." The assistant smiled politely. "He's expecting you." That alone made Emily's heart pound. The office was spacious, but not ostentatious. Large windows overlooked the city. Sunlight poured in, illuminating shelves filled with books, not awards. Jonathan stood as she entered. "Thank you for coming." Emily nodded. "Thank you for yesterday." He gestured for her to sit. "Tell me about yourself," he said. "Not your job, not your shift. You." Emily hesitated. "I don't think there's much to tell." Jonathan waited, so she spoke. About Lucas, about dropping out of college, about working nights and weekends, about how people assumed she was invisible. She didn't dramatize it. She didn't cry. And somehow, that made it heavier. Jonathan listened, hands folded, expression unreadable. When she finished, silence stretched between them. Then he asked a question she hadn't expected. "Have you ever been trained in conflict resolution?" Emily blinked. "What?" "You de-escalated a hostile situation yesterday," he continued. "You stood your ground without becoming aggressive. That's not instinct alone." She shook her head. "I just talked." Jonathan smiled faintly. That's what leadership often looks like before it's recognized. Emily shifted in her chair. "I don't think I belong in conversations like this." Jonathan leaned forward. "Emily, I built this company by paying attention to what others overlooked. And yesterday, I saw someone who didn't know her own value." Her chest tightened. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Jonathan replied carefully, "that Magnolia isn't just a restaurant. It's a business, and businesses need people who understand human behavior." Emily's pulse raced. "I'm not qualified." Jonathan nodded. "Neither was I when I started." He slid a folder across the desk. Inside were papers she didn't fully understand. Training schedules, shadowing opportunities, a temporary administrative role. "Think of this as a trial," he said. "Paid, flexible hours, no pressure." Emily stared at the folder. This wasn't charity. It was an opportunity. "And Lucas?" she asked quietly. Jonathan met her gaze. "Family matters," he said. "Always." Something inside her cracked, not in pain, in release. She left the office in a daze, the folder pressed to her chest. The city outside looked the same, but she didn't. That evening, she told Lucas everything. He listened silently, then shook his head. "You deserve this," he said. She laughed softly. "I'm terrified." "Good," he replied. "That means it matters." The next weeks were humbling. Emily learned quickly, but not easily. Meetings, emails, systems she'd never seen. Some people doubted her. Some whispered. A few looked down on her, but she showed up every day, and slowly, something changed. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was becoming. Emily learned something important very quickly. Opportunity opens doors, but it doesn't silence whispers. Her new role placed her in rooms she had never imagined entering. Conference tables polished to a mirror shine. Voices confident, sharp, uninterrupted. People who spoke as if their time mattered more than anyone else's. And she noticed the looks. Not all of them were hostile. Some were curious, some dismissive, some quietly judgmental. Why is she here? Emily felt it every time she walked into a meeting, every time she spoke, and someone glanced past her, waiting for a real voice to take over. At first, she tried to stay invisible. She took notes. She listened more than she spoke. She worked twice as hard just to avoid making mistakes. But invisibility didn't protect her. It erased her. One afternoon, during a planning session, a senior operations manager interrupted her mid-sentence. "That's not how we do things here," he said flatly, turning to Jonathan instead. "We've already discussed this." Emily felt heat rise to her cheeks. She hadn't been wrong. She had prepared. She had numbers to support her point. But the room moved on without her. After the meeting, she stood alone by the window, city traffic far below. Her reflection stared back at her, uncertain, small. "Maybe they're right," she thought. "Maybe I don't belong." Jonathan found her there. "You were right in that meeting," he said calmly. Emily turned, startled. "They didn't listen." "They will," Jonathan replied, "but not until you stop asking for permission to exist." She frowned. "I don't know how to do that." Jonathan folded his arms. "Neither did I at first, but I learned something early on. Competence earns respect, but confidence forces attention." Emily exhaled. "I don't want to be arrogant." "Good," Jonathan said. "Arrogance ignores others. Confidence stands firm. That night, Emily sat at her small kitchen table long after Lucas had gone to bed. Papers spread out, notes rewritten, ideas refined. She wasn't trying to prove she was better. She was proving she was prepared. The next challenge came sooner than expected. A supplier dispute threatened to delay operations across multiple locations. Tensions ran high. Voices rose. Emily listened. Then, when the room stalled, she spoke. Clear, calm, unflinching. She laid out a compromise, one that protected staff hours and avoided a costly delay. This time, no one interrupted her. Silence followed. Then someone nodded. Then another. The operations manager who had dismissed her earlier cleared his throat. That might actually work. Emily's heart pounded, but she didn't smile. She stayed steady. Jonathan watched quietly from the end of the table. Later, he stopped her in the hallway. "You found your voice today," he said. Emily swallowed. "I was scared." "You still spoke." Word spread, not fast, but steadily. Emily wasn't just the waitress anymore. She was someone who solved problems, someone who listened, someone who stayed when things got uncomfortable. Yet not everyone welcomed her rise. One afternoon, she overheard two employees whispering. She got lucky. She doesn't have the background. She's only here because of him. The words cut deep. That night, doubt returned. But so did resolve. Emily stood in the mirror and spoke aloud, quiet but firm. "I earned this." And for the first time, she believed it. The room was silent. Not the uncomfortable kind of silence filled with judgment, but the kind that follows truth. Emily stood at the head of the long conference table, her hands resting lightly on the polished surface. Around her sat executives, department heads, and senior managers, people who once spoke over her, dismissed her, or questioned why she was even there. Now, they were listening. The crisis had arrived without warning. A sudden labor dispute threatened to shut down multiple Magnolia Bistro locations during the busiest season of the year. Staff morale was fragile. Schedules were tight. One wrong move could cost jobs, reputation, and years of trust. Jonathan had turned to Emily earlier that morning. "I want you to lead this," he'd said. She'd stared at him, stunned. "Me? You understand both sides," he replied. "The floor and the office. That's rare." Now, here she was. Emily took a slow breath. She didn't rush. She didn't apologize. She didn't shrink. She spoke clearly, about fairness, about dignity, about listening before demanding. She proposed solutions that protected workers without jeopardizing the business. No theatrics, no ego, just honesty. When she finished, the room stayed quiet. Then the same manager who once dismissed her nodded slowly. "She's right," he said. "This works." One by one, others agreed. The plan passed, and with it, something else shifted: respect. Later that evening, as the building emptied and the city lights flickered on below, Jonathan stood beside Emily at the window. "You know," he said, "most people think leadership looks like power." Emily smiled faintly. "What does it really look like?" Jonathan glanced at her. "Responsibility." He paused. "I'd like you to stay, officially. Operations development." Emily's breath caught. You don't have to answer now," he added gently, "but I hope you do." That night, Emily walked home slower than usual. The city felt different. Not kinder, not easier, but fuller. When she opened the apartment door, Lucas looked up from the couch. "Well?" he asked. Emily smiled, tears forming. "I think we're going to be okay." Months later, Magnolia Bistro changed. Not because of new menus or renovations, but because people felt seen. Emily made it a point to talk to staff, to listen, to remember names. She never forgot where she came from, and the story of that afternoon, the three men, the bill, the moment someone refused to be small, became part of the restaurant's quiet legend. Emily Carter never became famous. She became something better, unshakable. Moral of the story: courage isn't loud, integrity isn't flashy, and standing up for what's right doesn't require power, only resolve. Sometimes the world tests you not to break you, but to reveal who you truly are. And sometimes the people who change everything are the ones who simply refuse to be disrespected. If Emily's courage inspired you, don't keep it to yourself. Hit the like button. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that standing up for what's right matters. And comment below your thoughts. Subscribe to Momentum Stories for more powerful, emotional tales that remind us of the strength we all carry inside. And turn on the notification bell so you never miss a life-changing story.